going to talk about the Holy Spirit. You'll remember at Pentecost, the Holy Spirit is the one who comes down on the disciples like flames of fire over all of their heads. Well, Basil's not really going to talk about that metaphor so much, but that is informing how he is thinking about the Spirit. So today, I want to talk about his work entitled On the Holy Spirit, and for our purposes, I just want to summarize three main arguments that he makes. First key argument is the role that the Holy Spirit plays. The Holy Spirit is very closely associated with God. And this, for Basil, comes from places like 1 Corinthians 2, and you can read there about how Paul says, "Who can know the mind of the Lord except the Spirit of the Lord?" And just as our spirit knows ourselves better than anyone else, so the Spirit of God is more closely associated and knows God more than anyone else. The role of the Spirit's proximity to God, close association with God, is also the role that the Spirit has with us. It is the Spirit who is in us. After all, God the Father reigns on the throne, and God the Son is at the right hand of God the Father, and yet it is the Spirit who has been poured into our hearts. And so for Basil, it's the Spirit's role in uniting us to the Son, to Jesus. And by placing the Spirit of Christ in us, it is as if we have been adopted as God's sons and daughters. So it's as if the Spirit has united us to God the Son, and therefore we can pray to God as Father. So that's the first aspect, the first argument that he makes is the role the Holy Spirit plays, and the way the Spirit is so closely associated with God and in us, uniting us to God. The second key argument for Basil about the Holy Spirit's full divinity is the Holy Spirit's activity. Because the Holy Spirit does the things that only God can do, the Spirit must not just be closely associated with God, but the Spirit must be God. So, for example, the Spirit, Basil sees, is involved in creation. And the Spirit, Basil has several proof texts showing that the Spirit is involved in our salvation. And the Spirit is also shown to have several activities involved with judgment. And the Spirit is also associated with God in worship, through prayers, through baptism. We're baptized in the name of the Father, Son, Spirit. Many of the liturgical hymns and confessions involve Father, Son, and Spirit, prayers, etc. And so Basil sees that if the Spirit is involved in creation, he must be creator, not created. If the Spirit is involved in salvation, he must be the God who saves us, not some agent of God who saves. If he's involved in judgment, divine judgment, only God can judge, and the Spirit is the one who judges our hearts. And in worship, why are we worshiping the Spirit, and why is the Spirit associated with God? It must be because the Spirit is, just like the Son, fully divine. Now the third argument that Basil makes steps into the idea of the Spirit's essence or nature. What is the Spirit? So who is the Spirit? The Spirit is the third person we know. The Spirit is the one sent at Pentecost. What is the Spirit? Well, that has to do with the Spirit's essence. What is the Spirit? And for the Spirit to be closely associated with God and to do all the things that God does, that must mean that the Spirit's very essence or nature is divine. And he has several arguments that are complex that we don't need to go into, where he wants to talk about how the three are ordered in a certain way, Father, Son, Spirit, but they're never ranked as first, second, third, because that would be to rank their divinity. The first would be fully divine, the second is less divine, the third is less divine. But for Basil, even though we can order them and differentiate Father, Son, Spirit, they're never ranked any different because they have the same nature, the same essence. And what is that essence? Well, it's the same essence as the Father and the Son, which in the divine nature of the Son and in the divine nature of God the Father, well, that essence, Basil says, is, quote, beyond comprehension. So that full transcendence of God, that full divinity, that full apophatic wonder that we experience when we talk about God, because God is beyond all talk, beyond all comprehension. He's infinite, immutable, impassible, immortal, incomprehensible. All of those things also apply to the Spirit, because the Spirit, in essence, is divine, and that means fully divine. So to summarize, Basil has had to make arguments showing that the Spirit is fully divine. And for us, the three key arguments are the role of the Spirit, the activity of the Spirit, and the essence or nature of the Spirit. But now I want to leave with one more question. Basil had to make this argument because there were certain people, like allegedly the Bishop Macedonius, and his followers were called the Macedonians, or the people who Basil calls the pneumatomachines, the spirit fighters, the people who were against the Spirit. While we can't do justice to their side of things, the point is that they were claiming the Spirit was not God, or at least not fully God. So that brings up the question, did Christians before Basil think that the Spirit was divine? Did they think that the Spirit was fully divine? Did they think the Spirit was associated with God? It is very tempting to think that early Christians didn't have a full and robust pneumatology, or doctrine of the Holy Spirit. But I think that's too simplistic of a way of saying it. It is true that most early Christians do not have a clear articulation of the Spirit's divinity. For the first 300 years, there is no confession that says the Spirit is fully divine, fully God. But that doesn't mean that the early Christians denied this idea. What I think you can clearly see from reading all the early Christian texts, starting with the New Testament itself, is that the Spirit is always closely associated with God. We're baptized in the name of the Father, Son, Spirit. The Spirit is the one in our hearts, enabling us to pray. And it's this sort of Trinitarian structure to the Christian life. If the Spirit is in us, uniting us to the Father, to the Son, and through the Son to the Father, then it must be the Spirit who is God in us. Just as Jesus is Emmanuel in flesh, so the Spirit is also God with us in our hearts. He is the love of God poured into our hearts, the presence and grace of God in us, enabling us to pray, enabling us to call on God, enabling us to worship, and enabling us to do the things God calls us to do. So if you look at early Christians before Basil, I think it's safe to say they were all Trinitarian in practice, even if they weren't always able to articulate their pneumatology as Trinitarian. Well, what Basil has given us is an argument showing that the Spirit must be fully divine. Now what's left is for us to try to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Because if we talk about God, and specifically God the Father as fully transcendent, and then we talk about the Son as fully God, also fully transcendent, and now the Spirit is also fully God. Well, how do these three relate to one another? That'll be what we have to talk about in our next discussion. See you then.